Thank you, Sheldon. It was actually true about that building site. I'll always stick to that story. Thank you very much, everyone, for being here tonight. It's fantastic to see so many familiar faces and friendly faces, and also some unfamiliar ones as well. So thank you very much for coming tonight. I wanted to, before I start, just say a special thank you to my immediate family, my close family, my wife Fran, wielding the iPad there at the moment as we speak, who, I want to thank her for her love and support really over the years, and enabling inspiration, enabling me to kind of do all this stuff really. She's also had to put up with the agonizing over the last couple of weeks. But anyway, that's over. Just write it. Equally, my son Rob, our son Rob, who's just literally legged it from London here, just made it in time. Rob's also a literature graduate, as I am, and at the moment he's studying arts policy and management as well. So he's one of my inspirations. And I just wanted to have a word as well for my daughter Nina, who isn't here tonight. She was unable to leg it from Leeds, and the reason, believe it or not, wait for it, is today she's got 2 coursework assignments due. So, I'm looking at my students here. I think they know where I'm coming from there. I know where she's coming from. So I have 2 hats on here, really. With my father's hat, I'm kind of cut up that she's not here, but with my academics hat on, I'm quite proud of her, really. So good on you, Neen, anyway, and she's also one of my inspirations. So, thank you. I want to begin by describing a fictional scenario. A man is preparing to make a proposal of marriage. The time is roughly the 1870s, and the place is the Erewash Valley, separating Derbyshire and Nottinghamshire in the East Midlands. The man is 28 years old and lives alone at the family farm. He's felt that his life is at a standstill, that something had to happen, marriage possibly, yet he seems to live too remote from contact with others. He's been subject to bouts of dissolution, heavy drinking, and the occasional romantic or sexual encounter. But then a woman, a Polish widow, comes to take up the position of housekeeper at the local vicarage. The woman has a 4-year-old daughter. They are refugees from political unrest in Poland and have spent some time in London, where her husband, a brilliant doctor, had died. The man comes to know the woman and her daughter, seeing them at church, or sometimes they visit the farm so that the little girl can play with the fowls. After several months, he decides to ask the woman to marry him. So, on a March evening, with the wind roaring outside, the man plucks up his courage and sets out to make the proposal. He approaches the kitchen of the vicarage and sees the woman inside with her daughter by the firelight. He knocks and is shown in. He proposes. She is initially unsure. No, I don't know, she says. But then, yes, I want to. They embrace and kiss, and then we read the following. He turned and looked for a chair, and keeping her still in his arms, sat down with her close to him, to his breast. Then, for a few seconds, he went utterly to sleep, asleep and sealed in the darkest sleep, utter, extreme oblivion. After this, they talk and embrace further, but the man is overwhelmed by the paradox that he and the woman are so foreign to each other, yet suddenly now so intimate. It's as if the intensity can't be sustained for too long, and the scene ends then in this way. He went out into the night. Big holes were blown into the sky. The moonlight blew about. Sometimes a high moon, liquid brilliance, scudded across a hollow space and took cover under electric, brown iridescent cloud edges. Then there was a blot of cloud and shadow. Then somewhere in the night a radiance again, like a vapor. And all the sky was teeming and tearing along, a vast disorder of flying shapes and darkness and ragged fumes of light and a great brown circling halo. Then the terror of a moon running liquid brilliant into the open for a moment, hurting the eyes before she plunged under cover of cloud again. Okay, well, some of you may recognize that this is a scenario from the first chapter of the novel The Rainbow, written by D.H. Lawrence, published in 1915. The chapter is called, with a kind of gentle irony, I think, How Tom Brangwyn Married a Polish Lady. I chose it because I've spent quite a lot of my research career thinking and writing about Lawrence, and also because I've always found the depiction of this scene incredibly moving. And I've identified those two features in particular because they stay in my memory, they've stayed in my memory, as striking examples of the kinds of surprise effect that literary texts can spring on their readers. The subject that I teach and research in, literary studies, provides us, of course, with ways of catching or categorizing those surprise effects. So, not perhaps the most auspicious start to a marriage, to drop off into a deep sleep for a few seconds immediately after you've proposed. But we might say this is Lawrence's representative of that movement known as modernism, which aimed to defamiliarize everyday experience so that we see it again afresh. It's also the Lawrence who, like many other modernists, is interested in the power of the bodily unconscious, which might at any moment override the workings of the conscious mind. And then there's that description of the night. I'd guess that all of us here in some ways recognize in Lawrence's description the thrill of coming out into that kind of night, those kinds of atmospheric conditions. Perhaps the fumes surrounding the brain from the couple of pints that you might have had a few minutes before will have kind of enhanced that effect. Though we might not have put it quite in Lawrence's terms, big holes were blown into the sky and a moon running liquid brilliant into the open for a moment. Again, literary studies provides us with a kind of frame for this effect. This is what you might call a landscape of desire, drawing from the repertoire of the Gothic imagination, the Gothic sublime. In other words, literally, it was a dark and stormy night. And this provides a language for extreme states of mind or being, not easily representable in realistic prose forms. The night then fully embodies the momentous thing that this proposal has been for Tom Brangwyn, the clanging torment, as Lawrence writes, that his passion is to him, and the sense that through those big holes he's at last ripped the veil of that old world and entered into a new and strange existence. Tonight, though, I want to forget about those explanatory boxes for a while. I want to set them aside. Instead, I want to use those instances of Lawrence's writing to open out and share with you some more fundamental questions that I think they themselves open out. What is it that literature does? What is it that the literary text knows? And this last question, what is it that the literary text knows, may sound strange. And if it does sound strange, I suggest that we might think about it through another area of study that I've spent a lot of my life exploring, and that is the relationship between literature and science. The aim of all this, at the end of the lecture, is to end up with some reflections on where we are in literary studies at the moment, and to present to you a couple of ideas about how the subject might begin, and actually is beginning in some respects, to kit itself out for new and exciting kinds of future. To begin to talk about literature and science, however, and to give you a kind of glimpse of what we do in that area, it's always to have to negotiate our way around the looming concept of the two cultures. Somehow, we can't seem to shake this concept off, however much we might want or try to. I myself have argued for years in various contexts that we should find a way of doing literature and science that doesn't defer to the two cultures. Yet here it is, smuggling itself back into the title of my own lecture. What does it mean then to talk of these two cultures? Maybe there's something in it after all. So let's spend a little bit of time just kind of characterizing and framing the two cultures debate. And I want to start with some words from the great Victorian evolutionary scientist T.H. Huxley. How often, Huxley writes, have we not been told that the study of physical science is incompetent to confer culture, that it touches none of the higher problems of life, and what is worse, that the continual devotion to scientific studies tends to generate a narrow and bigoted belief in the applicability of scientific methods to the search after truth of all kinds. How frequently one has reason to observe that no reply to a troublesome argument tells so well as calling its author a mere scientific specialist. Huxley's essay, Science and Culture, published in 1880, reminds us of the extent to which science in the late 19th century was still very much a relative upstart in terms of British education and culture. And a significant part of Huxley's work was a forceful and eloquent campaign for the introduction of science into school and university curricula, something, of course, now we take completely for granted. And what Huxley conveys here is a vivid sense of the entrenched prejudices ranged against science by a dominant culture whose values are grounded in classical and theological education. In other words, this is still a few decades before the introduction of the study of modern literature as we know it. Nevertheless, it's this culture, what we might call literary culture, that Huxley means and Huxley refers to when he elsewhere refers to, and I quote, the school and university traditions of the great majority of educated Englishmen. What he means there is that that tradition is a literary culture, a literary tradition. Huxley's words, incidentally, there remind us too that in the late 19th century we're considering an educational system still largely reserved for the male, the landed, the wealthy, the powerful. Okay, so that's Huxley. I now want to track this debate into the mid and later 20th century, when the concept of the two cultures as we know it emerges more fully. And I want to characterize this debate by two moments, one relatively well-known, I think, the other far less so, and the two of them separated by about 40 years. The first is the debate between the scientist and novelist C.P. Snow and the Cambridge literature scholar F.R. Leavis, a debate which roughly took place between 1956 and 1966. And in a topical and timely way, it just so happens that Cambridge University Press have recently republished both of these texts, which I'll now show you on my slide. There we are. Both recently published in kind of quite handsome editions. They were out of print for quite a while, so you can now they were republished last year. So if you ever want to hear anything again about the two cultures after this lecture, you could think about those texts. In October 1956, then, Snow published an article, The Two Cultures, in the New Statesman. And the article begins anecdotally, Snow recording an overheard comment from the leading mathematician G.H. Hardy from the early 1930s. And Hardy is quoted thus: "When we hear about intellectuals nowadays, it doesn't include people like me and J.J. Thomson and Rutherford." In other words, leading scientists, leading British scientists of their generation. So, let's flick back a bit. Snow goes on to argue that in the face of a traditional culture, as he puts it, which is, of course, mainly literary, this kind of cultural exclusion, the exclusion that Hardy complained of, not being categorized as an intellectual, was no longer a joke. The separation between the two cultures, Snow writes, has been getting deeper before our eyes, to the extent of a mutual incommunicability and even a refusal on the part of each culture to want to know the virtues of the other. These thoughts were then further developed by Snow when he was invited to give the Reed Lectures in Cambridge in 1959. Right at the outset of this debate then, and across his two works, we find Snow picking up that essential narrative thread from Huxley. Science is always obliged to confront a society in which intellectual value, or what Pierre Bourdieu taught us to call cultural capital, is held by the literary and the classical. This seems to be about historical tradition and vested interest, even before any question of what it is that literature and science actually do. Scientists must always tug their forelock to the intellectual precedents of literary culture, or rather not, in the case of Huxley and Snow. Mildly but insistently, Snow's polemic is that it's science that offers to transform and indeed define modernity, and that it must be recognized as embodying the true course of enlightenment and progress, embodying, in fact, a moral principle of social hope, a belief in the future, and the democratic principle of a mode of knowledge not defined by tradition and privilege. So to some extent, I think, Snow's polemic really is about science being about optimism, and, in the face of literary intellectuals who continue to insist on that the human condition was a tragic one. Snow's Two Cultures then became more or less officially a debate when the Cambridge literary critic and teacher F.R. Leavis entered the fray in 1962. Since the 1930s, Leavis had been a revolutionary figure in Cambridge English, himself, at least overtly, a democratizer of a kind. Literature for Leavis continued to be at the center of a civilized culture. In fact, Leavis claimed that the English school should be at the center of any university organization. But he also, at the same time, attempted to dismantle the aura of classical privilege that clung to the study of literature. Literary judgments, he insisted, were judgments about life, and so were dependent upon the sensibility of the critic as a person, and not on the kind of classical education they might have had. This also meant, however, that Leavis still embodied the prejudice that T.H. Huxley had complained of. While the literary intellectual could pronounce on life, the scientist was restricted only to their specialist field. That's Leavis's view. In Taking Snow On, Leavis argued that, in fact, there was only one, albeit extremely complex culture, and only the reductive thinking of a scientist such as Snow could come up with the idea that there was a simple divide between two cultures. You can't win, really. Leavis's commentary on Snow was seen also to be a personal and even vicious attack, which went beyond the bounds of respect and politeness expected in public discourse. He claimed not to be able to bring himself to describe Snow as a novelist, even though he was quite a well-published novelist, and saw in the manner of Snow's own endorsement of science a fatal lack of critical thinking. Okay, I want to fast forward now 40 years to my second moment of the two cultures. Now we're in America, and the moment is that of what we now call the SoCal Hoax. And this, I think, is probably the moment that is less well known generally. In 1996, the Interdisciplinary Journal of Cultural Studies, published from New York, Social Text, published an article by the mathematician Alan Sokal, an article entitled Transgressing the Boundaries Towards a Transformative Hermeneutics of Quantum Gravity. Now, don't worry, whatever side of the divide you're on here, I'm not going to waste time trying to describe Sokal's argument here, because as soon as this article came out, or actually 2 weeks later, Sokal very publicly announced that it was a spoof, a hoax. He'd perpetrated the trick because he wanted to expose the ignorance and gullibility of humanities intellectuals, literary intellectuals, in matters scientific. The issue was not just that in accepting the article, the journal's editors and peer reviewers had shown an ignorance of quantum physics. It was also, Sokal implied, that the journal's intellectual rigor had been compromised by an eagerness to publish a merely fashionable concoction of science, literary theory, and postmodernism. There is obviously a broader cultural context for this, and in America in the 1980s and 90s, this would be described no longer as a two cultures debate, but in America at that time, increasingly the phrases that were used were culture wars or science wars. So, overtly this is seen as warfare. How then do we compare these two moments, separated by 40 years? Well, one thing that you might notice that seems to have happened from the scientist's perspective is that where C.P. Snow had lamented the failure of literary intellectuals, to engage with or take an interest in science, Alan Sokal's aim appears to be to warn literary intellectuals to keep off scientific territory. So how did that happen? To explain, let me offer a brief and very ridiculously schematic thumbnail sketch of some key changes in the study of literature and science in the intervening period. And I'm conscious of thinking about some of my literature and science buddies in the audience, Martin, Erica, if she's there, please forgive me. It's very sketchy, like this. But this is the sketch of the kind of movements in the study of literature and science in recent history, if you like. So, first of all, up to about the 1960s, we studied the impact of scientific ideas on literature, and the traffic was always in that direction, never in the other direction. Then, from around about the 1960s, we discovered that science and literature were united by a common medium, which is language. The intellectual movement responsible for this discovery was called Structuralism, and it swept European and American culture with the proposal not simply that we use language for everything, but that the world is structured for us by language. In other words, that language uses us, in a sense. Then, grounded in this anthropological theory of language, we moved into an excitingly expanded project of greater interdisciplinarity, which I date from about the 1980s onwards, in which the notion of any purely literary text was questioned or collapsed into language generally, in the same way as science was opened up for study as part of a broader cultural field. Okay, so that's my sketch of literature and science. This is the field of the 1980s, is the field that I stepped into when I started my own research in the early 1980s, and it's provided me since with a rich and exciting series of possibilities for my work. I feel very grateful to have been around at that time and to have been able to contribute something since to the study of literature and science in this unbounded, interdisciplinary way. But there's a little irony colouring my sketch, which you may have picked up on here. Because while from one perspective, the new and exciting study of literature and science seemed to promise to dispel the divisions of the two cultures, from another perspective, it could be seen to reinstate an old story. In other words, if language is the master key to unlock both literature and science, well, who holds that key? The literary intellectuals, of course. As the French thinker Roland Barthes put it in 1967 in an essay revealingly entitled From Science to Literature, it was the role of literature to represent actively to the scientific institution just what it rejects, that is, the power of language. In other words, you have literature here informing science, as it were, about what it doesn't know about itself, which is that it's made up of language. And then, who are the we? Who is the we that I've been referring to in this exciting turn in the study of literature and science? Well, of course, again, it's the literary intellectual. The great move towards an interdisciplinary study of science always seemed to come from our perspective. And I recall here a number of conversations with colleagues over the years concerning events or conferences that we wanted to put on, in which we wondered about how we could get the scientists involved, not just by way of invitation to speak, that was easy, but to get them to want to come, or even to initiate involvement. And the kind of conclusion that always seemed to lurk behind these reflections was that scientists were always just too busy doing science. I disagree profoundly with the manner and some of the unfortunate effects of Alan Sokal's hoax. The editors of Social Text, Andrew Ross and Bruce Robbins, are fine and pioneering scholars, both of them in modern literary and cultural studies. In fact, in September, Bruce Robbins will be here as a keynote speaker, one of our keynote speakers at the John Berger conference, and where I'll expect him to talk about John Berger and not about the Sokal Hoax, but who knows. But I understand where Sokal's motivation came from. Given, as we've seen, the seemingly endless ways in which literary culture has seemed able to reinvent its own intellectual superiority, how surprising is it that some within the field of the sciences should respond with guerrilla tactics? And the affair should trouble those of us who work in literature and science. Do we know enough about science? And if we don't, should we stick to what we know? But what is it that we know, that literature knows? To bring these questions and those of the two cultures up to date means inevitably, at least in British culture, considering the work of Richard Dawkins, Professor of the Public Understanding of Science at the University of Oxford and one of our most prominent public intellectuals. And I'll assume that Dawkins doesn't really need too much introduction to here. We might think of him either in terms of those best-selling books on evolutionary genetics from The Selfish Gene of 1976 onwards, or more recently as the highly outspoken champion of atheism and scourge of what he regards as the delusions of religious belief. To turn to Dawkins is also, in a sense, to disprove my previous claim that work on the interaction of literature and science always comes from the literary field. One notable exception to this, which takes us back to rainbows, is Dawkins's 1998 book entitled Unweaving the Rainbow, Science, Delusion, and the Appetite for Wonder. And I want to spend a little while now just looking at some aspects of of this text of Dawkins, which of course claims to kind of cross, and address the two cultures divide. The rainbow in the title of Dawkins' book is a reference to the work of the English Romantic poet John Keats. Drawing on two sources, Dawkins attributes to Keats the view that Isaac Newton's science of optics had destroyed all the poetry of the rainbow by reducing it to the prismatic colours. And one of Dawkins' sources for this view is Keats' long poem of 1820, Lamia, which includes these words. I know there are some poets in the audience. For them, I promise I won't quote too many just short extracts from poems, because I know poets don't like that, but I think this is the only one. Philosophy will clip an angel's wings, conquer all mysteries by rule and line, empty the haunted air, and nomad mine, unweave a rainbow. That's where Dawkins gets the title of his book from. And we should understand, by the way, there that the word philosophy, that we should translate that as science. Okay, really what's being referred to here is natural philosophy. Okay, so as Dawkins explains at the outset of his book, Keats could hardly have been more wrong about rainbows. In a gesture of reconciling the two cultures, Dawkins' book proposes that both scientists and poets actually work in the spirit of wonder, and that the scientific analysis of a phenomenon such as the rainbow actually enhances and intensifies this wonder rather than clinically dispelling it. Another aim of uncovering the rainbow then, and this in some ways takes us back to C.P. Snow's project, is for Dawkins to argue that literary artists, and poets in particular, need to understand science more fully and take it more seriously. Dawkins therefore sets out to demonstrate in a series of specific cases how, if they had done so, their poetry would have improved. So what does this critical approach to literature actually look like in Dawkins's book? I want to share with you now two examples from that book, starting, actually, with D.H. Lawrence. So going back to D.H. Lawrence and to Lawrence's late poem, Hummingbird, which I will quote in its entirety, because it's not very long. I can imagine in some other world, primeval dumb, far back in that most awful stillness that only gasped and hummed, hummingbirds raced down the avenues. Before anything had a soul, while life was a heave of matter, half inanimate, this little bit chipped off in brilliance and went whizzing through the slow, vast, succulent stems. I believe there were no flowers then in the world where the hummingbird flashed ahead of creation. I believe he pierced the slow vegetable veins with his long beak. Probably he was big as mosses, and little lizards, they say, were once big. Probably he was a jabbing, terrifying monster. We look at him through the wrong end of the long telescope of time, luckily for us. Okay, so that's Lawrence's poem, Hummingbird. And here is Richard Dawkins' comment on the poem in his book, Unweaving the Rainbow. D.H. Lawrence's poem about hummingbirds is almost wholly inaccurate and therefore superficially unscientific. Yet in spite of this, it's a passable shot at how a poet might take inspiration from geological time. Lawrence lacked only a couple of tutorials in evolution and taxonomy to bring his poem within the pale of accuracy, and it would be no less arresting and thought-provoking as a poem. Okay, my second example of Dawkins' literary analysis, it brings us back to Keats. And this is a moment in the text where Dawkins sets up a comparison, a juxtaposition between two pieces of writing in the course of a discussion about the possibility of life on other planets in the universe and the irresistible urge to know more of the beauty of the universe. And this is the way Dawkins sets up the contrast. The great Indian astrophysicist Subramanian Chandrasekhar said in a lecture in 1975, "This shuddering before the beautiful, this incredible fact that discovery motivated by a search after the beautiful in mathematics should find its exact replica in nature, persuades me to say that beauty is that to which the human mind responds at its deepest and most profound." Okay, Dawkins continues, "How much more sincere that sounds than Keats's better-known expression of a superficially similar emotion. Beauty is truth, truth, beauty. That is all ye know on earth and all ye need to know." So they are the final two lines of Keats's Ode on a Grecian Urn, and I don't have time to look at the whole poem tonight, so in what follows you'll have to kind of take my word for what I say about that poem. So what do we need to say then about Dawkins's interpretations of poetry? Let's stay, first of all, with those two lines from Ode on a Grecian Urn. The problem here is that Dawkins is completely wrong. And when I say that he's wrong, I mean in the same spirit as his own scrutiny of the scientific accuracy of the poems, that he's factually wrong, rather than it's my opinion that he's wrong. But that's what Dawkins would say as well. So, factually then, it's not true that these two lines are an attempt by Keats to sincerely express an emotion that he felt at the time. Instead, the lines strike a dissonant or discordant note in the ode. In some ways, they contradict what has gone before. Their quietism, all you need to know in life is that beauty and truth are the same thing, is at odds with the spirit of restless inquiry and dissatisfaction, negation and uncertainty that characterize the rest of the poem. If we ask what the poem knows about its beautiful object, the Grecian urn, it is that the urn embodies an irresolvable enigma or paradox. Art creates beauty at the cost of fixing life in a representation. Desire is sustained, but at the same time frozen or paralyzed. Art celebrates life, yet sets itself apart from life. If we've read or studied the poem carefully then, we can only see in those final two lines an irony, or sense in them an untrustworthiness or duplicity. Where does this voice of such complacent certainty come from? Well, we notice, for one thing, that there are two voices there, because Keats gives those words in quotes there. That's the urn speaking. He voices the urn, and then the second voice there is the voice of the poem. So while Richard Dawkins may be right to identify an insincerity in the lines, he's completely wrong to see this as a failure of the poet Keats to be sincere. The insincerity is a poetic effect. Behind this particular misreading, therefore, lies a more fundamental principle, which is that poetry is not a vehicle for the direct expression of the views or thoughts of the poet. It's a voice, a form of artifice, in which knowing is more of a kind of exploration. Only the failure to understand this can explain why Dawkins sets up the comparison between Keats's lines and Chandrasekhar's statement. This is the kind of mistake, I think, that a philosopher might call a category error, in the sense that these are incommensurate kinds of utterance. They're doing completely different kinds of thing and are not comparable. In this light, then, we can revisit Dawkins' comments on Hummingbird. Lawrence, in his poem, remember, makes a passable shot at a hummingbird, and with only a couple of science tutorials could have made it much more accurate. Again, the category error, I think, lies in applying the principle of scientific accuracy as a value to a domain which is indifferent to that value, a bit like saying that a giraffe, in being a giraffe, fails to be a bacon sandwich or a copy of the collected works of William Shakespeare. I would agree with Dawkins in his implication, I think he does imply, that Hummingbird is not a great poem. And I wouldn't even question the idea that enhanced scientific knowledge might well produce a better poem. But where Dawkins is completely wrong, again, is the notion that Lawrence's poem is making a shot at getting anything right in a scientifically accurate sense. We might remember that the poem begins with the words, "I can imagine," which Dawkins imputes to mean, I can see back to the way things were, instead of the proposition, what if we thought of things like this? On this logic, then, we can easily imagine Dawkins' disappointment at the passable shot Lawrence makes of Tom Brangwen's Dark and Stormy Night, given that moonlight does not blow about, nor can big holes be blown in the sky. Must we say, then, in the same corrective spirit as Dawkins' assertion that Keats and Lawrence did not know enough about science, must we say that Dawkins does not know enough about literature, for example, about how poems work? Well, yes, I think. Though to me, this criticism is not as personal as it first sounds. After all, I would say, how could we expect Dawkins to know about literature and how poems work in detail if he's not been trained in that area? But to make this argument, I think, is to highlight a crucial fault line between the two cultures. Science tries to establish what is or is not the case, what is more or less accurate about the world, as Dawkins says. Thank goodness for that. And without scientific knowledge, we non-scientists are not in a position to intervene, say, in Dawkins's discussions of Newtonian optics, for example. But the work of art or literature is in a different position, one wholly bound up with that tricky category that we call the aesthetic. The literary text isn't bound to just state things as they are, but also has to give us sensual interest and pleasure through formal distinctiveness, organization, and beauty. And in a modern educated democracy, these things are subject to the evaluation of their success in a way that assumes, in a sense, that we're all entitled to our opinion on a work of art, whether we've trained in the study of it or not. So it's actually quite difficult for me to say that Richard Dawkins doesn't know how a poem works, because to say this sounds in our culture like a kind of insult. In the same way, to suggest that the understanding of literature requires a specialist training sounds in our culture like a kind of elitism, even though this is precisely what science requires and precisely why it seems we need professors for the public understanding of it. I suppose what I'm really interested in here is what authorizes Dawkins to write with such serene confidence across the two cultures divide about the scientific failings of poets and poetry. I suggest this is because science has become synonymous with knowledge and has therefore empowered itself to regard any other phenomenon, such as literature, as an object of that knowledge, at least in Dawkins's hands, obviously. Literature, on the other hand, means, well, a range of other things. In Dawkins's book, there is a small repertoire of familiar terms drawn from the early 19th century Romanticism that the book celebrates, by far the most prominent of which are terms like inspiration, wonder, mystical, and to which we might add terms like vision and imagination. But what do these words mean? How have they served us on the literary side of the cultural divide? How good are they, or dare I say it, how fit for purpose are they in describing or embodying what it is that literature does or knows? Unweaving the Rainbow, of course, is a testimony to Dawkins's claim that he loves literature, and the romantic repertoire is used to that very enthusiastic end. You know, it's a very enthusiastic endorsement of literature. Still, it's sometimes difficult to see what it is that Dawkins sees in the writers that he loves, given the vocabulary that he has to talk about them. I just want to briefly take the example of mysticism as an example of how this emerges. So just a few comments here from Unweaving the Rainbow. First of all, this is Dawkins' comment on who he describes as his favourite of all poets, and that is that confused Irish mystic, William Butler Yeats. Doesn't sound very good, does it, that? Yeah, confused Irish mystic, but his favourite poem. Mysticism for Dawkins is also a problem for William Blake's work, and who Blake, in Dawkins's account, remained content to bask in the wonder and revel in a mystery that we were not meant to understand. So, in other words, the scientist uses this wonder as a platform for further investigation. So, when Dawkins comes across Blake writing of Bacon and Newton, that their terrors hung like iron scourges over Albion, Dawkins's verdict on this, to say Dawkins's verdict on William Blake at this point is, what a waste of poetic talent. So, when we look back over the struggle that science has had to resist the imperious superiority of literary culture, perhaps it's understandable that a representative figure like Dawkins should emerge, tenaciously fighting back by asserting the superiority of its exclusive access to knowledge and the vigor, clarity, and simplicity of its pursuit of human progress. This is not just two cultures, remember, but war, culture war, science war. But war, as we know, is a dirty business. And while we can smile at Dawkins's well-meaning condescensions towards literature, and I think there's an element of kind of playfulness in Dawkins' argument as well. There's also a darker side which emerges in Dawkins' attitude to literature's very close neighbour, philosophy. Here it's interesting to note as well that Dawkins too played a part in the debates around the SoCal Hoax. In 1998, in the journal Nature, he very enthusiastically reviewed a co-authored book by Alan Sokal. He gave it a really good review. But the review begins with some comments on a French philosopher, the French philosopher Félix Guattari. And this is the way Dawkins's review in Nature begins. Suppose you're an intellectual imposter with nothing to say. but with strong ambitions to succeed in academic life. Collect a coterie of reverent disciples and have students around the world anoint your pages with respectful yellow highlighter. What kind of literary style would you cultivate? Not a lucid one, surely, for clarity would expose your lack of content. The chances are that you would produce something like the following. Okay, Dawkins then proceeds to quote from the philosopher, as I say, Félix Guattari, who's the co-author with Gilles Deleuze of some of the most important and influential works of contemporary philosophy, and they've certainly been very influential on my thinking about literature and science. I don't reproduce the quotation because to do that would be to reproduce Dawkins's technique, and the technique is very simple and also, I think, in some ways highly problematic. You take a piece of philosophical prose, you quote it out of context, and then invite the presumably uninitiated reader to share your contempt and ridicule for its unintelligibility as a piece of writing. In a curious way, then, the technique demonstrates that behind Dawkins's thinking is a very strong theory of language, which underpins his work within and across the two cultures. Our language, he writes in Unweaving the Rainbow, must strive to enlighten and explain. And this goes with a sharp vigilance in Dawkins's work towards jargon. You know, he hates jargon, he's always on the lookout for jargon. But there is a difference, surely, between specialized languages and jargon, which I think is the kind of more devious use of specialized languages for different purposes. Dawkins's very role as Professor of the Public Understanding of Science at Oxford suggests that science itself does work through highly specialist languages, which surely guarantee its tenacious knowledge, but which require then translation into a wider clarity. But no such entitlement to their own specialist languages belongs, for Dawkins, to literature or philosophy. If these discourses do not immediately render themselves up in the form of transparent lucidity, they are seen to be fraudulent. You are an intellectual imposter, sprouting fashionable nonsense, or, and I like this one, the meaningless wordplays of modish francophone savants. So, if Unweaving the Rainbow is Dawkins's attempt to heal the rift between the two cultures, I hope I've begun to show how literature and philosophy might need to be saved from this effort, well-meaning on the literary side, less so on the philosophical. Peacemaking requires, arguably, mutual respect and toleration of difference, even before anything like understanding might occur. And what I find deeply troubling is the aggressive intolerance and distrust shown by Dawkins towards the very idea that those disciplines, pursuing their own approaches to what it is they know, might have to develop their own complex languages to do so. This is the same kind of intolerance, incidentally, that we find in F.R. Leavis's work towards science and scientists. Dawkins, interestingly, in his often barely suppressed rage, polemical rage, is far more Leavis than Snow. What follows then now are my own two concluding proposals for a future for literary studies beyond the two cultures, which is also a means of addressing the kinds of damage that Dawkins' work represents. The first, which I'm sure you'll by now be expecting, is that literature itself needs to be seen as a mode of knowledge. Does Tom Brangwen go to sleep when he proposes to Lydia? Yes, though the sense in which we know sleep here might combine our actual customary meaning with something else, which tweaks or stretches that meaning. Are big holes blown in the sky? Yes, this is true for Tom Brangwen's knowledge at that moment, a knowledge which is equivalent to but different from that which an analysis of atmospheric conditions might give us. Okay, I'm going to just change tack a little bit. In recent years, the philosopher and post-colonial literary critic Gayatri Spivak has turned in her work to the bold endorsement of an arts education as a strategic means to address the stark inequalities of a rapidly globalizing world. Globalization is inherently tied to the digital delivery and availability of information, as we know, seen, of course, as a leveling and democratic phenomenon. And Spivak, certainly no Luddite, concedes that the globally digital can be the condition and effect of a just world. But Spivak also notes that still, for the vast majority of the rural poor and urban underclass of both southern and northern hemispheres, it is the book and writing, rather than information, that still constitutes the main source of human emancipation. At this moment, then, of rapid cultural transition, Spivak asks, Are we clear about what is really at stake in that relationship between the digital and the analog, if you like? In voicing her concern for the force of literature as a cultural good, Spivak argues on behalf of those who might still believe in that archaic instrument called the book, who might believe that it might take time to train the imagination. This is the time it might take, for example, to read a long novel like Lawrence's The Rainbow, which is time that my students and I, because we talk about these things, increasingly recognize is more difficult to find, or time that we no longer have. Literature, Spivak writes, is what escapes the system. You cannot speed read it. Yet, she argues, we might be in danger culturally of forgetting how to read with care. And notice that the imagination here in Spivak is understood not as in Dawkins in terms of the confused yet quaintly endearing mystic poet waiting for his inklings to be turned into concrete good by the scientist. This, I think, creates a kind of mystique around the notion of the literary imagination, which Dawkins subscribes to and buys into. Spivak's conception of the imagination, by contrast, is a far more demystified thing. It is the disciplined, attentive faculty we might need to imagine, for example, a planetary economics of redistribution rather than of competitive self-interest. It might be a way of using the imagination to think about what that might feel and look like. The imagination then in this reading does not simply supply, but is in effect, or might be, a politics of transformation. Spivak's notion of literature as cultural good then brings me to my second proposal, and this is that literature should, albeit extremely subtly and thoughtfully, begin to make its own claims for the notion of human good, of human benefit, even of human health and well-being, a ground, in other words, that we might think is currently occupied by the sciences and by medical science in particular. Studying for a degree in literary studies or English in higher education is, of course, alive and well. It continues to be seen as a kind of gold standard subject in arts and humanities education, rejuvenated by creative writing recently. It delivers high levels of literacy and critical thinking, the kinds of flexible skills that employers continue to prize, often over more specialist professional training. If you're wondering, yes, I have slipped into my Saturday morning open day spiel there. Do you recognize it? In the discipline, too, we've prided ourselves on providing ourselves and our students with a panoply of critical skills with which to analyze literary texts, again having moved far beyond the seemingly more innocent romantic lexicon of inspiration and vision. But that's the other thing to say, about Dawkins's, literary criticism, is that it's very, very old-fashioned, but then, you wouldn't expect him to know necessarily what's going on in literary studies. We now examine how texts explore and expose issues of gender, ethnicity, and class, and indeed how the texts themselves might be constrained by history and ideology. This, though, has at times turned into what some theorists have begun to call a hermeneutic of suspicion. In other words, a way of analysing texts that is constantly on the lookout for forms of ideological limit, collusion, weakness, or blindness. It's something that the critic Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick has described as a kind of neurotic mode of reading. We neurotically pursue the text to kind of uncover its blindnesses and so on. It's almost as if in justifying the literary in terms of the kinds of valuable byproduct it gives us, we've forgotten that literature might simply be itself, as if embarrassed, perhaps, by the ways in which literature might itself constitute or enact forms, not just of cultural good, but possibly even of health and well-being, of physical and psychological good. In literature and in literary studies, this has begun to change. One of our most important contemporary novelists is Zadie Smith. And Smith continually reflects on the relationship between the two, literary studies and literature, because she's a writer who trained in literary studies. Her 2009 collection of essays, Changing My Mind, is named as such because of a principle of openness and unpredictability in the literary process that she seeks to identify. Looking over her essays, she writes in the foreword to the volume, "I'm forced to recognize that ideological consistency is, for me, practically an article of faith." And in another essay, looking back on how her university training had, she says, made her a lonely and combative or aggressive reader, she writes, as follows. Nowadays, I know the true reason I read is to feel less alone, to make a connection with consciousness other than my own. To this end, I find myself placing a cautious faith in the difficult partnership between reader and writer, that discreet struggle to reveal an individual's experience of the world through the unstable medium of language. Tentatively, hesitatingly, I think, a writer like Smith is beginning to reactivate the open potential of literature to heal and console, and also, therefore, to care. One of her key reference points is the American novelist David Foster Wallace, who died in 2008. And in a long essay of tribute to Foster Wallace, Zadie Smith quotes him on the importance of imaginative access to other selves. And this is David Foster Wallace. Since an ineluctable part of being a human self is suffering, part of what we humans come to art for is an experience of suffering, necessarily a vicarious experience, more like a sort of generalization of suffering. Does this make sense? We all suffer alone in the real world. True empathy is impossible. But if a piece of fiction can allow us imaginatively to identify with a character's pain, we might then also more easily conceive of others identifying with our own. This is nourishing, redemptive. We become less alone inside. It might just be that simple. Now, it might just be that simple is ironic coming from Foster Wallace. Last year I read his key work, Infinite Jest, a fiercely technical and an intellectually demanding 1,000-page tour de force. It's a wonderful novel, but it's 6 months of your life, basically, especially if you read it by the bedside table. The novel's two main locations, a high-ranking tennis academy or hothouse in which young athletes are contained, and a drug addiction rehab center, attest to the novel's insistent concern with human damage and how this in various forms might be represented and addressed. By a kind of contrast, we have the fiction of Japanese novelist Haruki Murakami. There he is. So cool, isn't he? The recurrent motif in Murakami's fictions is the young runaway, escaping from family breakdown or indifference into an uncertain future. The novels spend a lot of time lingering over the seemingly banal details of these young lives, what they eat and drink and wear, the clothes they wear, the music they listen to, the casual encounters, friendships and relationships that they have. There's a curious, gentle didacticism about Murakami's writing, as if the aim of all this is to help kit out the young person for survival in a world of great uncertainty and fragmented market relations. It often swerves into unembarrassed moments of advice about how to live your life. Murakami's work is enormously popular with bright, younger readers, yet has been largely ignored by academic criticism, as if, I would speculate, such criticism is itself embarrassed about the way fiction such as Murakami's is prepared to play its therapeutic cards more openly. I confess I'm treading very delicately here. There are many dangers, notably around how this sense of therapeutic good might be translated into the discipline of literary studies. Such dangers were flagged up in a way in Susan Sontag's famous 1964 essay Against Interpretation, in which Sontag argued that an excess of interpretation, the revenge of the intellect upon art, was stifling our sensual responses to art, requiring us ceaselessly to translate the elements of art into something else. We can't afford, though, to polarize art and intellect more than they have been done. This would be another version of the two cultures divide. And we see the dangerous consequences of this in Dawkins's reflex anti-intellectualism. Somehow the notions of literature as a form of knowledge or intellectual rigor, as a form of good, need to be thought or held together. And perhaps the difficulty with that seems to be a deeper legacy of two cultures thinking itself. But things are happening. In the critical field, new languages are emerging. Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick proposes to replace that neurotic mode of reading with what she calls reparative reading, while French thinker Bruno Latour embraces something called compositionalism, an ethically motivated critical practice that avoids the concept of mastery or victory over a text. And in a number of different contexts, literary texts are already being put to work in academic contexts in various different ways. Within our own School of Education, two such initiatives are developing. Given that tourism is how our culture increasingly spends its post-industrial time, we're looking at ways of exploring the links between literature and place, the kind of restorative potential of literature in its relationship to place, and in ways that are critical rather than merely celebratory. And in the field of the medical humanities, a very fast expanding field, through our association at the moment with Stroke Association Cymru, we're beginning to look at how texts might be put to work in ways that we might call bibliotherapeutic, based on the idea of bibliotherapy. I'll end, though, with a proposal made by one of Richard Dawkins's philosophical bêtes noires, and I would have to do that, wouldn't I? This is Gilles Deleuze, the French philosopher Gilles Deleuze, and this takes us back to the whole question or questions of what it is that literature does or knows. And this is from Deleuze's essay, Literature and Life. To write is certainly not to impose a form of expression on the matter of lived experience. Literature rather moves in the direction of the ill-formed or the incomplete. Writing is a question of becoming, always incomplete, always in the midst of being formed, and goes beyond the matter of any lived or livable experience. Deleuze suggests then that it isn't in fact enough to see literature as a form of inquiry into what we know. We should note that it's always likely to go beyond lived or livable experience, and certainly in that sense beyond accuracy. Instead, it should accompany us into a future which is always strictly open and uncertain. What literature knows in this sense, then, is always something to do with the ceaseless ability of life to be unpredictable and to create the new. I like to think there's something of what Deleuze would have called a line of flight in Tom Brangwen's experience in Lawrence's The Rainbow, coming out of the vicarage into the disorder of the night, knowing little of what lay ahead of him, except that it would be a new phase of life for which he would need to be as fully alive as possible. We can only perhaps commit to this open future with the fullest possible knowledge of what we are and what we might be. And science and literature can help each other to arrive at this knowledge, as long as we can learn to listen to voices of peace and trust rather than war in the continuing debates between the two cultures. Thank you.